My name is Celia Vaughn. I'm 35 years old, and at 6:28 on a Thursday evening, while carnations and floor disinfectant sat heavy in the cool air behind the chapel, and folding chairs scraped across tile for my grandfather's visitation, my mother finally said the thing this family had been rehearsing around me for years. The preparation hallway was crowded with cousins, staff, and church people moving in low voices, all of them trying to look solemn in that public way grief teaches people to perform. I was still wearing black flats and the plain navy dress I had put on after correcting 2 death certificate errors, confirming a vault delivery, and checking a pre-need trust note that could not wait just because our family had decided mourning was a good backdrop for succession theater. Then Lorraine Vaughn pressed the office keys into Eli's hand, looked straight at me, and said, "Women comfort the dead. They don't carry the business." She said it in front of a removal driver, 2 embalmers, my uncle Randall, and 3 cousins who had never stayed late for an audit response or a permit correction in their lives. Eli took the keys the way men like him always take things they did not build, like the room had already agreed it was his. That line should have humiliated me into tears. Instead, it clarified everything. I did not remind my mother who handled state inspections, pre-need files, vendor debt, payroll gaps, and every quiet emergency that kept the funeral home legal, while Eli drifted in for handshakes and sympathy speeches. I did not ask whether my grandfather would have preferred sentiment over solvency when the next renewal, permit chain, and trust response were all still sitting under my credentials. I just stood there, with carnations, bleach, and chilled air in the back of my throat, and understood all at once that none of this was sudden. Eli got the handshake. I got the filings. Eli got the public grief. I got the private structure. In this family, I was good enough to keep the place lawful, just never good enough to be named its future. So I set the visitation packet on the hallway credenza, walked past them, and left them their little inheritance scene before anyone could ask me to smile through it. 4 days later, the state board and the trust officer called because Eli had already started presenting himself as owner, but the license, the pre-need file, and the transport permits still ended in my name. Before I tell you what froze first, and why my mother suddenly needed me to show some respect, tell me what time it is where you are, and where you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story like this travels before it lands on someone who already knows what it feels like to keep the family business alive and still be told you were only ever meant to stand beside the dead, not carry the living thing. Here's what they didn't understand when my mother pressed those office keys into Eli's hand, like grief had somehow converted itself into legal authority. They thought they were doing what they had always done: put the visible son in front, push the useful daughter into function, and trust that I would keep the machinery underneath it all running, because I always had. What they were actually doing was staging a succession story on top of a funeral business they did not control. I work in funeral operations and compliance, which means I do not hear the phrase family transition the way my mother does. I hear establishment licensing, pre-need trust reporting, chain of custody exposure, transport authorization, state audit risk, and the exact point where family sentiment starts pretending it can outrun regulation. For 5 years, while Eli drifted in for the public part of grief, I did the work nobody in that family wanted attached to their names. I cleaned up old audit problems. I rebuilt the pre-need reporting calendar after one missed cycle nearly triggered a formal corrective plan. I fixed death certificate errors at 9 p.m. because waiting until morning would have delayed burial permits. I negotiated vendor debt when invoices started stacking. I covered payroll gaps during slow quarters because families do not stop dying just because cash flow is ugly. And because the state board and the bank's trust division had finally stopped believing Lorraine's confidence counted as compliance, the key operational chains ended in me. My credentials sat on the establishment license. My administrator record sat on the pre-need trust file. My name sat inside the transport permit chain. None of that looked impressive in a receiving line. Eli still got to be the one shaking hands at the chapel door, speaking softly to clergy, and being praised as the future of the Vaughn name. I got the filing deadlines, the permit logs, the invoice calls, and the part of the business that had to be right, even when nobody wanted to look at it. By the next morning after the visitation, I was in my office with cold coffee beside my keyboard, pulling the entire structure into one clean folder, because I already knew Thursday had not ended at humiliation. It had moved into exposure. Funeral establishment license records first, then the pre-need trust administrator file, then the active transport permit chain and removal schedule permissions, then the inspection reports from the years my mother now likes to call a difficult stretch, as if the place had not nearly been flattened by sloppiness and denial. Then the payroll rescue transfers and vendor payment emails. After that, I opened Lorraine's texts and emails, which read almost indecently clear once I stripped away the mother tone. Keep the place alive quietly. Do not frighten your uncle with state language. Your brother is what people need to see right now. After everything your grandfather built, do not punish us with paperwork. There it was again. The whole family theology in 4 lines. Eli got seen. I got used. He got the name. I got the regulatory burden that kept the name from becoming a lawsuit. Around 8:12 Monday morning, I made the first professional move. I did not call my mother and ask whether she had already started telling clergy, staff, or community families that Eli was taking over in any real legal sense. I did not send Eli a wounded message about fairness or what it means to inherit visibility instead of competence. I confirmed the active license file, checked the trust reporting portal, reviewed the next permit queue, and sent one written instruction to the funeral board contact, the trust officer, and counsel that any inquiry tied to operator transfer, pre-need administration, or permit authority had to come through me directly and in writing. Then I sent a second note clarifying that no change in licensed responsibility, trust administration, or transport authority had been approved. No anger, no scene. Just the end of assumption. The consequences moved faster than I expected. By Monday afternoon, the bank trust officer was asking whether the next pre-need response should be treated as unchanged or in transition. By Tuesday morning, a state board coordinator wanted clarification on who was actually responsible for the upcoming establishment renewal, if Eli was now publicly presenting himself as the new face of the business. Then Tuesday night, Eli posted a black and white photo from the chapel foyer with a caption about carrying the family calling forward. That was the first clue this was already bigger than one ugly line in a hallway, or one key handed over for effect. My mother had already sold a legal handoff story to the outside world, on top of a license, a trust chain, and a permit structure she assumed I would never force into daylight. Funny how often families call a woman respectful, when what they really mean is unlikely to interrupt the lie. And if they had already started telling the public he was in charge, the next question was obvious. What happens when the state asks who actually is? The first panic call came 4 days after the visitation, at 8:43 Tuesday morning, while I was in my office correcting a death certificate amendment for a family that had already waited too long because a physician's signature line had been entered wrong the first time. I had one screen on permit logs, one on the next pre-need reporting deadline, and one on the Vaughn file I had been very carefully refusing to call a crisis until somebody outside the family used language sharp enough to earn it. The call came from the state funeral board, and the second the coordinator asked me to verify my administrator status, I knew Eli's little new face of the business performance had already hit the wrong desk. "Ms. Vaughn," she said, measured in the way regulators get when they are already making notes. "We need clarification on operational control. Public-facing materials and community statements are suggesting a leadership transition, but the active establishment license, transport authority path, and compliance contact still resolve to you." There it was. Not because my mother had found a conscience. Not because anybody in that hallway had spent the weekend feeling ashamed about what she said, while my grandfather lay 20 feet away. Because the system had finally reached the point where family theater stops counting as authority. I told her to send every concern in writing and to treat any leadership change language as unverified unless it came through me directly. Then I hung up and wrote the line that mattered most in my notes. Public succession story moving faster than regulatory authority. At 8:57, the second call came from the bank trust officer who oversaw the pre-need reporting chain. His voice was less careful and more irritated, which in my world usually means someone has already spoken too confidently in a room where fiduciary language was listening. "Celia, I need to know whether the Vaughn pre-need file is changing hands," he said. "We've got an outstanding audit response, one late supporting attachment, and now I'm hearing your brother is presenting himself as the new operator." There was the next pressure point. Eli had not just posted a sentimental black and white photo. He had already started talking like control had shifted, while the trust file still sat under my name. I told the officer the same thing I told the board. No transition had been approved. No administrator substitution had been filed. Route everything in writing. By 9/11, both emails were in my inbox, and both carried the same institutional tone my family never learned to fear early enough. Clarify now, or the file will clarify for you. At 9:16, my mother called. At 9:21, she called again. At 9:27, Randall left a voicemail in that low, respectable tone men use when they want coercion to sound like dignity. "Show some respect," he said. "This is not the week to start making trouble." There it was again. Their public overreach, my disrespect. Their dependence on my licensing and trust authority, my emotional problem. I still did not answer because discipline is one of the only pleasures left when your family is certain you will eventually reorganize your whole day around their panic. At 9:34, the family thread woke up after 4 days of condolence comments, chapel photos, and Eli's little legacy language. Lorraine wrote, "Celia, answer the board." Eli followed with, "This is literally just formal stuff." Randall added, "We have clergy and community people watching how we handle this." Formal stuff. As if the establishment license, the pre-need reporting chain, and the body transport permits were decorative paperwork, instead of the thing that keeps a funeral home from turning into a state action with flowers out front. I let the messages sit and finished the death certificate correction, because I wanted one more ordinary, lawful thing done before I stepped fully into the emergency they had manufactured. At 10:02, The outside escalation actor arrived in the form my family could not sentimentalize away. The removal service dispatcher called to confirm 2 transports for Thursday and asked whether Eli was now authorized to sign the permits because that's not what the active file says. There it was. Not because they missed me, not because they were sorry, because bodies do not care about family mythology. Permits either carry the right authority or they do not. I told the dispatcher no authority change had been approved and that any deviation from the current permit chain would need written confirmation from me. By 10:19, the state board had forwarded its written concern. By 10:26, the trust officer had copied counsel on the audit response deadline. By 10:31, the transport issue had become a real operational threat instead of a family spat. At 10:43, my mother finally left the voicemail I had been expecting since Friday. She did not sound maternal. She sounded inconvenienced that the daughter she had publicly reduced was still sitting inside the machine. "Celia, call me back and fix this quietly," she said. "Your brother has already been speaking with clergy, and if the board starts asking questions now, you are going to humiliate this family in the middle of mourning." Fix this quietly. There it was again. Not "I'm sorry." Not "can we talk?" Not even a decent lie ambitious enough to call itself misunderstanding. Just the command. Convert public disrespect back into private labor. Not because they cared, because the file still did. At 11:07, Eli called, and I answered because I wanted his panic before my mother translated it into softer language. He did not say hello. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Mom says you're making me look illegitimate." I looked at the license renewal on one screen, the trust portal on another, and the years I had spent cleaning up permit errors, audit messes, and cash gaps while he practiced sounding solemn in the receiving room. "You presented yourself as in charge before you had control," I said. "That is not my work." He inhaled sharply. "So you're really going to drag the state into this?" There was the inversion in its cleanest form. Their lie becomes my escalation. Their assumption becomes my cruelty. "No," I said. "The state is doing what it's supposed to do." Then I hung up. By 12:18, the board had requested formal clarification. By 1:04, the trust officer had flagged the pending response as exposed until administrator status was confirmed. By 2:11, one of the transport permits due later that week was sitting in a queue that could not move cleanly under a false public succession story. The tone had changed from clarification to containment. I sent one sentence to Lorraine, Eli, Randall, and counsel after that, and only because I wanted the words somewhere they could not revise later. No transfer has been approved. Then I turned my phone face down and went back to the permit file, because if I was going to be accused of disrespecting the family, I was at least going to do it after finishing the work that still kept actual dead people moving lawfully through the system. What would you do when the same people who told you not to make this ugly only started panicking once the board, the bank, and the transport chain all learned your name was still the one holding the funeral home together? The next morning, the problem changed categories. Up to that point, my mother still thought this was about whether I was being generous enough. Eli still thought it was about whether I was cold enough to interrupt his public inheritance performance. And Randall clearly believed the right mix of mourning language and family pressure could flatten the whole thing into one more technical mess I would absorb before the memorial open house. But at 8:05 on Wednesday morning, the state board sent its formal clarification request. The bank's trust officer forwarded the outstanding audit response, with my administrator name highlighted in the subject line. And the transport permit queue came back with an authority exception note attached to one of Thursday's removals. The wording on those 3 documents made my whole body go cold in a way the Visitation had not. The issue was no longer whether my feelings have been hurt in a hallway. It was whether my name was being publicly leveraged inside a licensed funeral operation after my authority had been publicly erased. That was when the story stopped being about grief and became about self-preservation. I called the trust officer first and asked the only question that mattered. Has anyone represented directly or indirectly that I already approved a transition and that this is just a filing lag? He did not answer immediately, which in my line of work is usually the answer. Then he said, "Your mother described it as a family succession already understood internally. Our issue is that the trust file does not say what the public language says." Understood internally. There it was. The Vaughn family religion translated into fiduciary language. My work was assumed. My consent was atmospheric. My brother's performance was apparently more real than the administrator record I had spent 5 years cleaning, protecting, and dragging back into compliance. I thanked him, hung up, and opened a new folder on my desktop, labeled exactly what the situation had become. Vaughn Funeral Home, unauthorized succession assumption, full record. Then I built the file the way I build any case that needs to survive denial, selective memory, and the soft moral violence of family language. Funeral establishment license record first, with my name still sitting there as the active compliance holder. Then the pre-need trust administrator filings, one by one, including the quarter where I had to rebuild the reporting sequence after old entries stopped reconciling, and the bank almost escalated the entire file. Then the transport permit logs, each chain tied to my signer status, because the state does not care who shakes hands best in a receiving line. Then the inspection reports. Then the vendor payment emails. Then the payroll rescue transfers from the 2 slow quarters my mother now describes as those little hard stretches, as if I had not moved my own money to keep licensed staff paid, while Eli practiced looking solemn in public. After that came Lorraine's texts and emails, and once I stripped away the mother tone, they read less like pleading and more like an operating manual for how this family had used me. Keep the place alive quietly. Do not frighten Randall with state language. Your brother is what the families need to see. This is what your grandfather would have wanted. Do not punish us with paperwork. There it was again. The whole value system laid flat. Eli got visibility. I got the file. He got the surname. I got the systems that kept the surname from becoming a state violation. Around 9:42, the board's field representative added the official bridge I needed by asking whether any public-facing succession language was being used before the named compliance contact had been formally changed. That moved the whole thing out of the realm of private injury and into professional contamination. If clergy, staff, and local families were being told Eli was effectively in charge, while the license, trust reporting, and permit authority still resolved to me, then my mother was not just being cruel. She was trying to spend my professional credibility after publicly downgrading it. I thought about being 28 and staying at the funeral home until 11:40 p.m., fixing a death certificate chain because one wrong county code would have delayed burial, while Eli was upstairs talking to cousins about the family mission. I thought about being 31 and explaining to a board inspector why records had slipped the year before, while my mother called me a little too rigid with process in front of the staff. I thought about being 33 and covering payroll during a slow quarter with savings I was supposed to be using for my own down payment, only to hear Randall tell a pastor later that Eli had the right presence to lead the place. Every time I fixed it, they called me family. Every time I named it, they called me difficult. At 10:26, my mother called from the office line, which meant she was done pretending to sound wounded and ready to sound managerial. I answered because by then I wanted her plain voice, not the mother voice she uses when she wants access to sound like love. "This has gone far enough," she said. "No hello, no Celia. The board is overreacting, the bank is making the trust issue sound worse than it is, and your brother cannot be embarrassed in front of clergy because you are in one of your moods." I asked, "Did you tell them I had already agreed?" Silence. Then, "I told them the family had this handled." I wrote that down too, because it was not just dishonest, it was revealing. My mother had never believed my authority was real authority. She believed it was back office labor with a state number attached, the kind of thing that should dissolve the second the son she preferred needed the title. "No," I told her. "What you want is not respect for Grandpa. It's retroactive permission." She went sharp immediately. "After everything your grandfather built, you owe your brother a clean transition." Oh, there it was again. Not trust, not respect. Debt. The debt I was apparently supposed to pay forever because I knew how to stop a funeral home from slipping out of lawful operation, while the men in my family practiced sounding important. "What I owe," I said, "is accuracy to every file carrying my name." Then I ended the call and sent one written instruction to the board, the trust officer, the permit contact, and counsel, confirming that no transfer of compliance authority, pre-need administration, or transport signer responsibility had been approved, and that any contrary representation should be treated as unauthorized. At 11:08, Eli texted, "Mom says you are doing this because no one ever trusted you with the front." I read it once and filed it, because by then I could finally name the relationship accurately enough to stop bleeding inside it. This was not love under pressure, not family under grief, not respect for my grandfather's name. It was access dressed up as legacy, not trust, debt, not family, extraction. The funeral home's memorial open house started Friday at 5 p.m., and I walked in at 5:19, because timing matters when people are still relaxed enough inside their own lie to keep performing it. The front chapel lights had been dimmed to that soft amber funeral homes use when they want grief to look warm instead of procedural. Coffee sat on silver urns near the side credenza. White lilies and carnations breathed sweetness over the sharper smell of floor disinfectant and polished wood. Clergy from 3 local churches stood in low conversation near the guest book. 2 longtime vendor contacts hovered by the hallway that led toward prep and removals. Staff moved with the careful shoulders people use when they know something is wrong, but not yet public. At the center of it all, beneath the framed portrait of my grandfather, stood Eli in a dark suit, taking hands and nodding like ownership had already settled itself inside his posture. My mother was beside him in black silk, greeting families with damp eyes and the exact expression she uses when she wants pain to function as insulation. Randall stood near the chapel doors like he had appointed himself guardian of the Vaughn name. And near the arrangement table, holding a leather folder too tightly for a social visit, was the State Board field representative. Good. The room already contained the only audience that mattered. My mother saw me first and crossed the lobby quickly, smile attached but thinner now. "Celia," she said under her breath, "do not make this ugly in front of clergy." There it was again. Their public fiction, my ugliness. Their staged succession, my timing. "You already did that when you announced authority before the file existed," I said. Eli turned at the sound of my voice and raised his hand to the nearest pastor with a little half-smile, as if I were some family inconvenience he could absorb into dignity. "Look who finally came to support the open house," he said. That was my ignition line handed to me for free. Support would have been a strange word to use before you started presenting yourself as operator under a license chain you do not control, I said. The room did not go silent all at once. It thinned. One vendor stopped stirring his coffee. A deacon lowered his cup. The receptionist near the front desk looked down at the monitor, then at me, then back at the monitor. The board rep did not move. He just waited. That was enough. I set my folder on the arrangement table beside the memorial cards and opened it without hurry. Establishment license record. Pre-need trust administrator file. Transport permit chain. Board clarification request. Trust officer note. Then I turned the top pages toward the field representative and 2 clergy instead of toward my family, because professionals and practical people are usually the first honest ones left in rooms like that. Before anyone here keeps speaking as though Eli is already the lawful operator of this funeral home, I said, the active license, the pre-need trust administration, and the transport permit authority are all still in my name, and no transfer has been approved. Eli laughed too fast. "Oh, come on," he said. "Are we seriously doing this here?" "You did it first," I said. "You just did it in a lobby full of mourners." That line traveled. You could feel it move through the room because everyone there understood, at least dimly, that something private had just become formal. My mother took one step closer and lowered her voice into that sharp whisper she uses when she wants morality to sound like etiquette. "Show some respect." "No," I said. "Show some accuracy." The board representative opened his folder then. "For clarity," he said, calm enough to make the words land harder, "our office has not received any approved change in compliance holder or operational authority for this establishment." One of the pastors frowned. A vendor near the side hallway asked, "Then who is responsible for the business right now?" I answered before my mother could wrap it in grief language. "I am the named compliance holder in the state file and the active administrator in the trust reporting chain," I said. "He is performing succession on top of it." That was the needle line, and it landed because even Randall went still. Eli's face changed then, losing the polished public solemnity and showing the smaller, angrier thing underneath. "You're humiliating this family over paperwork," he snapped. There was the inversion exactly where it always shows up. Licensing becomes paperwork. Trust reporting becomes paperwork. Permit authority becomes paperwork. Women like me are always expected to carry the file quietly until the moment we use it, and then suddenly it is just paperwork. "No," I said. "I'm refusing to let regulation be erased into inheritance." The receptionist's screen answered for me a second later, with the trust portal prompt that had been sitting unresolved all day. A bright little notice. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just one operational reminder blinking where staff and clergy could both see the front desk tense around it. The field representative looked once, then back at Eli. "Our office also needs clarification on 2 active transport permits, and an outstanding renewal sequence," he said. "Until authority is corrected, public leadership claims create a real compliance problem." One of the clergy actually took a step back. A longtime vendor who had done removals with us for years glanced at me and asked quietly, "So, who can sign off tonight if something changes?" "I can," I said, "and I haven't transferred that authority." My mother went pale, then furious. "After everything your grandfather built, you would shame us like this?" she hissed. I looked at the portrait, the flowers, the staff, the pastors, the little crowd my mother had gathered to witness Eli's soft coronation, and then back at her. "You used mourners as witnesses to a lie," I said. "I'm just the first person in the room willing to name it." That was the end of the performance, even if no one cried yet, because the room turned procedural. The board rep asked for a Monday meeting on license authority and permit continuity. One pastor quietly told his wife they should leave the family to sort business matters. A vendor stepped away from the coffee urn and started checking his phone. Staff stopped pretending the open house was only about remembrance. I closed the folder, picked it up, and stepped back before the moment could cheapen itself into tears and amateur family ethics. At the chapel door, Eli called after me, voice cracking now. "You're doing this because no one ever saw you as the future." I turned once. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because you told to wear what I kept legal." Then I walked out into the cold Knoxville evening, while the memorial open house kept trying to breathe behind me, without clean authority, without settled trust control, and without the daughter they had always counted on to make the ugly part invisible. When a family uses your silence as staging for a public lie, telling the truth is not disrespect. It is the first honest audit anyone has done in the room, and the consequences had only just learning how to speak. The memorial open house did not make me feel vindicated. It did not send me home glowing with justice or standing in my kitchen replaying Eli's face with anything that looked like peace. It made me feel overstimulated, slightly sick, and so awake at 2:14 a.m. that I was sitting at my dining table in the dark with a cold cup of tea, my suit still hanging over the chair beside me, staring at the legal pad where I had written 3 words and then stopped. License, trust, permits. That is the part people lie about when they tell stories like this badly. Public truth does not always feel like freedom the first night. Sometimes it feels like your nervous system accusing you of betrayal because it was trained to believe your value lived in how quietly you could keep the family business lawful, while other people were allowed to look sentimental in front of it. By Saturday morning, the tactic shift had already started. My mother texted first, saying I had humiliated her in front of clergy, families, and people who did not need to see private conflict during a sacred time. Randall followed with the practical version, saying the board representative was now overly attentive, staff morale was fragile, and I had turned one family transition into a regulatory problem. Eli's messages were the ugliest because they finally sounded honest. The first called me bitter. The second said I had always mistaken control for worth. The third said I would rather wound the family name than let him step into what Grandpa built. The fourth was the truest without meaning to be. You could have let me have one night. There it was again. The whole Vaughn religion in one sentence. Let the visible son have the night. Let the useful daughter have the burden. Let me carry the inspections, the trust reporting, the permit chain, the payroll gaps, the late vendor calls, and then call me cruel the second I refused to disappear behind it. What unsettled me most was not what they said. It was what some older, more obedient part of me was still waiting for. Permission. Permission to stop rescuing them. Permission to stop converting my mother's panic into sequence. Permission to stop mistaking usefulness for belonging. So instead of answering any of them, I did what my family has always hated most. I took the pattern somewhere it could not be sentimentalized. My therapist, Dr. Elaine Mercer, has an office above a tax practice in downtown Knoxville that smells faintly like cedar and old copier heat. And by Monday afternoon, I was sitting across from her with my coat still on, because I knew if I relaxed first, I would start minimizing. I gave her the facts in order because facts are safer than grief. The visitation hallway, the keys, my mother's line, the state board call, the trust officer's note, the permit issue, the open house, the board rep. My mother calling me disrespectful when what she meant was visible. Elaine let me finish, then asked the one question that changed the category of the whole story. When did your family first teach you that your competence was the price of staying loved? I stared at the edge of her rug for a long time because I already knew the answer, and because saying it aloud would make it impossible to romanticize later. I was 13 when my mother started leaving death certificate packets and filing folders for me, while Eli got taken to the front chapel because families respond better to a son. I was 26 when I covered a payroll shortfall with my own savings and got thanked by being told not to mention the amount because it would undermine your brother's confidence. I was 32 when I spent 2 weeks repairing pre-need reporting errors, while my mother told a vendor Eli had the right presence to lead the place. Elaine did not tell me to forgive them. She asked the question under the question. How long have you been calling rescue love? That one stayed in my ribs. I went home and wrote the pattern the way I would write any operational chronology that needed to survive scrutiny. Eli gets introduced. I get assigned. Lorraine promises. I stabilize. Randall moralizes. I clean. Public softness on one side, regulatory labor on the other. Once it was on paper, the guilt lost some of its holiness. It started looking less like conscience and more like conditioning. Then came the meeting. My mother texted Tuesday morning asking for one adult conversation before this becomes permanent, which in my family has always meant, let us rename the damage before the file does it for us. I agreed only because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could hide behind lilies, clergy, or my grandfather's name. We met that afternoon in the funeral home office after hours, prep schedules pinned to the wall, old printer toner in the air, stale coffee near the filing cabinet, and the hum of the refrigeration unit low through the back corridor. My mother started with revision. She said the hallway line had been badly timed, not cruel. Eli said the open house had only been meant to reassure the community. Randall said no one expected me to make a public issue out of what should have stayed inside the family. Then I laid the file down, one document at a time. License record, trust filings, permit logs, inspection reports, payroll rescue transfers, vendor emails, my mother's messages telling me to keep the place alive quietly. The room changed the way rooms always change when paper finally outruns tone. My mother snapped first. You always need documents to feel important. No, I said. I need documents when people around me keep trying to inherit what I kept legal. Randall called me rigid. Eli called me vindictive. Then he said the truest thing in the room by accident. "You could have just signed it and let me have this." There it was. Not legacy, not family. Access. Clean enough to stop pretending. Something inside me went still then, not dramatic, not wounded, just finished. I am not approving a transition because Mom promised you authority before she controlled it, I said. I am not cleaning up a public succession story that was built on my silence. I am not putting my name back under this funeral home to protect another family fantasy. And I am done being the daughter you remember only when the systems stop cooperating. My mother called that cruel. Randall said I was making everything final over technicalities. Eli started talking louder, the way men do when they realize the calm woman in the room is no longer carrying the structure for them. I stood up anyway. "No," I said. "I'm just done being your back office." Then I took my file and left while they were still trying to turn consequences back into disrespect. The fallout took a little over 5 weeks, and the reason it landed so hard was that it moved through the dull adult places first. Not through dramatic shouting, not through one spectacular public ruin. Through board follow-ups, trust scrutiny, permit continuity, vendor hesitation, and the kind of written clarification that makes family mythology sound childish the second it hits a real file. The state board did not shut the place down, which would have been too clean and almost generous. It did something worse. It started asking precise questions in writing. Who was the active compliance holder? Who was responding to the renewal sequence? Who was supervising transport authorization? Whether public-facing succession language had been used before the administrator record changed. The bank's trust officer held the pre-need response in active review until authority was clarified, which meant Eli's soft little new face of the business performance suddenly had to stand next to an unresolved audit trail he did not know how to read, let alone fix. The transport chain slowed too. Not because anyone was being vindictive, because permits attached to the wrong story do that. They stop being routine and start becoming risk. That was the first chain reaction. The funeral home's image did not collapse because I yelled. It collapsed because official people started asking official questions in places where my mother's tone could not protect her. Staff noticed before the family admitted anything. The removal driver stopped taking Eli's instructions at face value and started checking the active sign-off path. One embalmer, who had spent years watching me repair the messes nobody else could name, quietly asked whether he should keep sending inspection items through my inbox until this gets sorted. A clergy coordinator paused a memorial referral until the board issue stabilized, which is polite language for, "I do not trust your structure right now." Even vendors got careful. One casket supplier asked for updated billing confirmation before extending normal terms. The flower account stopped feeling automatic. Families may grieve in soft language, but businesses do not. They tighten at the first smell of instability. My mother hated that part most. Not that the file was exposed, that strangers had started asking the exact questions I had been answering alone for 5 years. She tried every register she still had left. First bitter, then punitive, then softer and meaner at the same time, which was always her strongest mode. "You are punishing the community now," she said in one voicemail. "You are punishing your grandfather's memory," she said in another. What she never said was the truth. She had tried to hand Eli a funeral home built on my license, my trust reporting, my permit chain, my payroll rescue money, and my willingness to stay invisible. The second invisibility ended. So did the fantasy that his handshake counted as infrastructure. I did not rescue the whole business, but I did one narrow ethical thing because boundaries are not the same as collateral cruelty. Through counsel, I authorized a one-time compliance handoff memo for current services already in motion, so no active family lost time on a burial, cremation authorization, or transport because my mother had chosen theater over sequence. Nothing broader. No emergency smoothing for Eli. No quiet fix for the trust file. No invisible weekend rescue. Just one controlled act separating grieving families from the family fantasy that had caused the mess. After that, I became unavailable in the only way that matters. Written only. Every board question through counsel. Every trust question through counsel. Every, can we talk as family? Ignored unless it came attached to an actual document and an actual operational issue. About a month after the memorial open house, the state board requested a formal declaration confirming that no transfer of compliance authority had been approved and that any contrary representation had been made without my consent. The trust officer requested matching written confirmation that the active administrator record remained unchanged pending any lawful substitution. I reviewed both, corrected one date, tightened one phrase, and signed them the same afternoon. No embellishment. No revenge monologue. No daughterly grief hidden inside regulatory language. Just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scene I could have made in the chapel. Because once the facts were fixed in the board file, the trust chain and the permit record, my mother could no longer keep narrating me into the role of difficult daughter, instead of the woman who had quietly kept the funeral home lawful. Facts do not grieve. They do not negotiate. They just sit there until everyone else's prettier version runs out of room. A month later, my mother asked to meet, and I almost said no because by then I understood something I had spent most of my adult life trying not to understand. Closure is not the same thing as restored access, and access is not the same thing as love. Still, I agreed to one final meeting because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could soften it back into funeral home weather. We met in my attorney's conference room at 4:42 on a Thursday. Late light flattening against the blinds, stale coffee cooling untouched near the side credenza, and the kind of dry office air that makes every sentence sound more official than the speaker intended. Lorraine arrived first in one of her dark wrap dresses, the kind she wears when she wants to look maternal, burdened, and morally innocent all at once. Randall came in next with the posture of a man who had spent years standing beside the wrong choices and still hoped that counted as dignity. Eli came last. No chapel confidence now. No public sun solemnity. Just a man who had finally learned that being handed keys in a hallway is not the same thing as carrying a licensed business. My mother opened exactly the way I knew she would. Not with apology. With hardship. "This has been devastating for the family," she said. There it was. The old rearrangement. Blur the damage. Make it communal. Make it sound like weather so nobody has to name where it began. I let the silence sit there long enough to become useful. Then I gave her the cleanest sentence I had. "You handed Eli a funeral home identity built on my license, my trust administration, my permit chain, and my labor. Then expected me to keep it all lawful after telling me women were only fit to comfort the dead." My mother cried after that, and maybe the tears were real. They usually are by the time consequence finally reaches people who thought sentiment counted as structure.
But tears are weather, not proof. And I had finally learned not to confuse visible pain with accountability. Randall tried next because men like him always step in after the first softness fails. "We were trying to preserve your grandfather's legacy," he said. "That's all this ever was." I looked at him and felt nothing but accuracy. "No," I said. "That's what you told yourselves. What it actually was another plan built on the assumption that I would absorb the risk and disappear behind it." Eli spoke then, and the saddest part was that he still sounded more baffled than ashamed. "Mom said you'd understand," he said. "I thought it was basically handled." There it was, the whole family structure in one sentence. He got the promise. I got the process. He got the handshake. I got the license renewal, the trust response, the transport chain, the payroll rescue, and the part nobody wanted to look at. "That was always the luxury you were given," I told him. "Other people were assigned the seriousness for you." My mother asked the fantasy question after that, the one families like mine always ask once the useful daughter is still physically in the room, but no longer psychologically available on command. "Is there any way to fix this?" she said. That line might once have worked on me because I used to hear vague pain and immediately start converting it into labor. A filing, a call, a quiet correction, a softened consequence. A way to keep everyone from having to feel the full shape of what they did. But by then I knew the difference between being needed and being loved. And they are not interchangeable, no matter how many mothers cry when the file stops protecting them. "You cannot fix this with emotion," I said. "You can only deal with it through sequence." Then I told them what accountability actually meant. Not a speech after the public story had already failed. Not tears in a conference room. Not calling me family now that the board, the trust officer, and the permit chain had all stopped cooperating. Accountability is changed behavior that costs you something. Accountability is telling the truth before the file forces it. Accountability is admitting out loud that you used one child as infrastructure while praising the other for standing on it. My mother flinched at that because it was the first sentence in the room she could not decorate. Randall asked if everything now had to go through lawyers. Anything involving licensing, trust money, permits, payroll support, vendor obligations, or emergency rescue does, I said. For the rest of it, maybe one day, if behavior changes before language does. That was the real answer. Not reconciliation, not permanent exile. Structure, distance, terms. 6 weeks later, I accepted an executive operations role with a regional memorial services group in Nashville. The kind of job nobody hands to a woman by accident, and nobody keeps unless she knows exactly how to run the thing underneath the polished language.
A month after that, I bought a quiet townhouse in my own name on a tree-lined street outside downtown Knoxville. Clean title, no family mythology in the walls, and enough calm in it that no one else's emergency could pretend to belong there. Then my attorney sent the final notice. Clean, narrow, non-negotiable. I would never again license, shield, finance, backstop, or quietly save any family business that erased me in public and expected my credentials in private. No more off-record rescue. No more just this once. No more grief language used as a solvent for paperwork. I approved the letter without changing a word. That was the deeper revenge. Not that Eli lost the owner fantasy. Not that my mother had to watch the succession story shrink under board questions, trust scrutiny, and permit exposure. Not even that Randall finally had to learn the difference between name and structure. The deeper revenge was this. I was no longer available for the role they had written for me. I was not the back office, not the hidden operator, not the daughter who kept the business lawful while someone else got remembered as the future. They did not miss me as family. They missed the function. Too many families call that legacy because admitting the difference would force them to look at what they built. So tell me honestly, if your family only remembered your value when the license, the trust file, or the permits were at risk, would you ever let them back in once you finally put your own name on a life they could not touch? And what would have been your breaking point? The hallway line, the frozen filings, the memorial open house, or the moment you realized they never really meant family in a way that included your dignity?